When you think about how we've evolved as humans, we've always eaten. And in fact, the problem of how to eat is our biggest shared problem. So you look at everything from, the evolution from hunter-gatherers to farmers, learning to control fire, the creation of cities, how cities literally, physically evolved. It's all around food. So, I like to say, you can kind of look at any situation in human history and food will just be there because people always had to eat. So it's not just how do you produce it and make it, but how do you share it, how do you preserve it, how do you plan ahead, And that was the same for our ancestors as it is for you and me this weekend. The problem's never gone away. It's just that the trappings of it and the way we do it has changed. If you look at the history of Paris and London, it's a very interesting comparison because London is on a navigable river. The Thames is navigable, the Seine is not. This means that when London ran out of food, it could just send ships and go and get grain from somewhere else because it could bring it in really easily. Paris couldn't do this. So the king, the French king, was called the baker of last resort. He took responsibility for feeding the people. It was highly political. Paris was surrounded by a series of grain-producing regions, and when the harvest failed, which it did very frequently, the city went out armed and extracted grain from the countryside, which is extremely unpopular. Now, what happened in the 1780s? The system didn't really work well anyway at the best of times, but then a big Icelandic volcano erupted, and there were about 10 years of failed harvests. And Paris had no backup, so the people were starving. They went to the king, they said, "You're the baker of last resort, feed us." And he had nothing to feed them with. So he tried to escape the city, and we know what happened. He got brought back, put on trial. All this Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake." It all comes from this. If you think about it, it comes from the geography of Paris. London, the English king, never tried to feed London. He didn't have to. So we have a depoliticized way of thinking about food. We have a free trade way of thinking about food. Never mind, bring it in from somewhere else. It's just fascinating how geography has created two completely different ways of thinking, politically and economically.
You call the current food system a disaster? Why is that?
We're trashing the planet. It's unsustainable. We externalize the true costs of the food that we produce. So, I would say there is no such thing as cheap food, and there never has been and there never will be. Food is the most important thing in our lives. The true value is something like probably half of our income. If you really internalize what we expend in terms of habitat destruction, pollution, soil degradation. If you internalize all those costs and the cost of obesity and everything that goes with that, the way we're feeding ourselves is a disaster for us and the planet. We don't see it because all the depleted fish stocks globally, the amount of waste. It just goes on. It goes on. But because we haven't quite hit the buffers yet. And it's all predicated on oil, and oil is cheap at the moment. Everything seems okay again, but actually 2008 with the great, the banking crisis, and when the price of oil was really high, it really started creaking at the seams. So to use a Nassim Taleb term, it's a very fragile system that we've got. Sitopia really means food place. It's from the Greek sitos, which just means bread or food, and topos, place. And I invented this word sort of almost by mistake, but I was analysing utopian thinking about how we should live because this seemed to be the closest that we have to a kind of multidisciplinary way of thinking about how we should dwell. And it struck me that not only do all utopias talk endlessly about food, but they never really recognise it. And as we know, you can't have utopia. It doesn't exist, which I find quite upsetting. So I thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a way of thinking about how we should live in a multidisciplinary way that we actually can have, because in fact we already have it. So in my thinking, we already live in Sitopia. We already live in a world made by food, shaped by food, but it's just a bad Sitopia because we didn't think through food while we were doing it. We kind of let it happen. Now if we start thinking through food, we can make a better Sitopia, which means eating differently, farming differently, minimizing this kind of horrible bottleneck of power at the center of the food system. These would all make a much, much better Sitopia, which also becomes closer to utopia. If you think of the bottleneck of the food system, so we have lots of producers here, maybe. Maybe better to have them as roots, like the right roots of a tree. To get to all of us, we're the branches of the tree. They have to go through the trunk. The trunk is supermarkets, distribution systems, the big players in the food system who have control. They sit between us and the producers, and they have incredible power, because if you think about food, it's necessary, we all have to have it, so control of food is power. We've let this system evolve, and it's undemocratic, because if you imagine that was normal power, political power, we wouldn't put up with it for a second. But this is what we've got in our food system, which is, I would argue, as important, if not more. So I just say democratise the food system, join the branches to the roots. This is what a farmer's market does, for instance, is what community-supported agriculture does, is what Carlo Petrini calls co-producing, which is basically meeting the producers halfway, thinking consciously about who's making my food. I need to pay them a proper wage. I need to think about what kind of life they've got to. And maybe I get involved in the food production myself. All of these ways of doing it joins the producers to the consumers. It weakens the trunk. It means the trunk no longer has a monopoly. When you start thinking through food as I do, everything changes, the way you think changes. You see it everywhere. I see it now, the fact that we've got a break between talks, because we're human, we need intake and output. So that's what's happening now. But of course, we're also socialising. So it's just such a fundamental thing. I would say, in a way, food is too big to see, because it's everywhere. We tend to take it for granted. So I should have said that in the talk probably, because it's quite a useful idea. But if you learn to see it, then that really is transformative.